On June 14th, 2025, immediately after a right-wing extremist assassinated politicians essential to the Democrats, thereby giving control of the Minnesota legislature to Republicans, Elon Musk retweeted false information and said, quote, "The far left is murderously violent." 3 days later, Musk's AI, Grok, was asked, quote, "Since 2016, has the left or right been more violent?" And Grok correctly answered that data suggests right-wing political violence has been more frequent and violent. But Musk replied, quote, "Major fail, as this is objectively false. Grok is parroting legacy media, working on it." Elon Musk fails to perceive the truth when he sees it because he is ideologically captured by a persistently pushed narrative. And the same may be true of you if you also believe that the left has been more violent recently. Now, here's what's really amazing, though. Not only is the left currently significantly less violent than the right, which I know will be hard for some of you to believe, but Elon Musk alone has caused more damage to people than the entirety of the left combined. And I'm talking about both physical and financial harm caused in the last decade. Given that context, his statements go from factually incorrect to outright absurdly ironic. But I don't expect you to just blindly believe me, so I'm going to show you what I mean. First and foremost, let's address the nature of that narrative I was talking about, the narrative that misleads so many people into believing incorrect things about political violence. You see, the right and the left are attracted to and convinced by very different kinds of rhetoric. And this causes an imbalance in the discourse that gives rise to misconceptions. Right-wingers are more attracted to anecdotes than statistics. There could be many different reasons for that, but one I suspect is that the right tends to have less trust in institutions, and in order to even have access to large data sets, the involvement of institutions is necessary. So they're left with a less reliable way of gaining information about the world, things like individual statements and video of specific incidents. Oddly, however, some right-wingers seem to magically suddenly trust a statistic in cases where it seems to support their position. Make of that what you will. Usually, though, rather than look at statistics, a right-winger will see individual acts of violence in videos and then extrapolate that behavior onto an entire group of millions of people, like the political left, for instance. Right-wing influencers take advantage of that cognitive vulnerability, a great way to brainwash people into believing the opposite of the truth is with a persistent narrative established through repetition. It's the same reason people are supposed to regularly attend church. The ability to dishonestly push a narrative that attempts to associate millions of innocent people with a few violent people is why they are so good at shaping and maintaining false perceptions in the minds of so many people. Leftism is at a clear disadvantage here because by their very nature, they do not value that tactic for the very reason that leftists are more likely to champion causes against bigotry, while right-wingers are more likely to embrace bigotry. Yes, I realize the irony of me telling you that right now, and deny it all you want, but consider their concerns. They champion anti-immigration causes, exclusionary policies, anti-LGBT legislation, white supremacist ideology, national isolationism, religious fundamentalism, etc. The right is about excluding and homogeneity, while the left is about including and diversity. The result is that right-wing politicians, influencers, and media outlets will hyper-focus on acts of political violence by the left, while completely ignoring or burying all the many acts of political violence by the right, with the specific goal of making the left look more violent. Meanwhile, the left typically does not engage in that same tactic because they don't value anecdotes and they don't draw sweeping conclusions based on the actions of a few. This means that there's an imbalance in the rhetoric that many right-wingers mistake for an imbalance in the violence. The truth is that not only does the data show that right-wing violence is more frequent and more deadly, but you can also find many more anecdotes of right-wing political violence. I'll show you some of the more egregious ones you never hear about. But first, what if an event is too big to be ignored or buried, and it goes against the right-wing narrative about violence? In response to such an event, right-wing politicians, influencers, and media outlets will just simply shamelessly lie about it. They will muddy the waters and generate enough doubt, confusion, and debate to cause fatigue and eventually even abandonment of the topic itself. This is part of the tactic Steve Bannon called flooding the zone with shit. Think of all the lies that were immediately spread about the January 6th storming of the Capitol, for instance. I already went over a lot of those in my video called The Narrative versus the Truth, so I won't do it again here, even though much more could be said about it. More recently, though, the right-wing media machine had to do damage control to protect its narrative from the fact that a far-right extremist assassin went on a shooting spree, killing a prominent Democrat politician and her husband, and shot and wounded another Democrat politician and his wife. Those two survived, fortunately, but not for lack of trying to kill them. He shot one of them 9 times and the other 8 times in front of their daughter. 4 Democrats shot, nobody else. Republican politicians, far-right influencers, and media outlets immediately spread falsehoods, claiming that this assassin of Democrats was an obvious Democrat himself. And here's the thing, millions of people seemed to either believe them or at least be persuaded enough to say that they don't know either way. So, who really was this assassin? And what really motivated him? Before I get into that, let me just say that after a killer shoots a bunch of people, immediately hunting for the killer's political ideology so that we can play the blame game doesn't sit well with me. It's more useful to learn what we can about it for prevention methods rather than blame game methods. But when so many people lie about it, and successfully convince millions of people of those lies, we're sort of forced to play this game just to set the record straight. But please know that it doesn't go beyond that for me. If you're a conservative, I'm not trying to implicate you the way a lot of these far-right influencers try to implicate leftists, no matter who the killer really is. My greatest disdain is not for regular people like you, but for those dishonest influencers, politicians, and media outlets. Here are some facts about the killer. He caused 4 casualties, 2 killed and 2 wounded, all Democrats. The prosecutors say he visited the homes of other lawmakers who fortunately were not home at the time. Their names were not released, but Senator Ann Rest announced on June 16th that she was made aware that the killer's vehicle was parked near her house that Saturday. She is a Democrat. The police recovered a notebook from the car that included a list of 45 elected officials he planned to kill, all Democrats, including Tim Walz and Ilhan Omar. He also plotted to kill various doctors at Planned Parenthood locations. He was an evangelical preacher who gave anti-LGBT sermons. Here's an example of him doing that.
No sin.
Il n'y a aucun péché
That God can't take care
que
of.
Dieu ne peut pas enlever.
Nothing.
Il n'y a rien.
There's people, especially in America,
Il y a des gens, particulièrement aux États-Unis,
they don't know what sex they are. They don't know how their sexual orientation. They're confused.
ils ne savent pas ce qu'ils sont exactement. Ils ont une confusion.
The enemy has gotten so far into their mind and their soul.
Et l'ennemi est entré dans le fond de leur pensée et de leur âme.
But this word,
Mais ces paroles,
The killer's lifelong friend identified him to the police after receiving incriminating text messages from him. According to that same friend, the killer was very anti-abortion, was a Donald Trump supporter, liked the Alex Jones show, and said he would be very insulted about all these people calling him a Democrat.
He would be offended if people called him a Democrat.
And David Carlson, once again, his roommate and best friend, known him since fourth grade, did say Bolter voted for Trump and that he was a strong supporter.
Beyond his friend, though, does any official record indicate who he voted for? Well, the Minnesota DFL party released data showing that he voted in last year's presidential primary election, but not as a Democrat. The Republican Party of Minnesota knows if he voted as a Republican, but they declined to share their data on him because they said they consider that data to be private. Given these facts, his political ideology and motive seem fairly obvious to me. So how were right-wing influencers able to convince millions of people that this killer of Democrats was himself a Democrat? Well, through three misleading arguments. Argument number one, he shot the only Democrats who broke party lines to vote with Republicans for a bill that would deny medical benefits to illegal aliens. What are the facts? Only one of the Democrats he shot voted with Republicans, Melissa Hortman. The other Democrat legislator he shot, John Hoffman, voted against the Republicans, so that motive would not be consistent. The details of their votes are also something to consider. Melissa Hortman negotiated with the Republicans by agreeing to disallow undocumented adults from receiving medical benefits if undocumented children could continue to receive medical benefits. So not so cut and dry. She still successfully fought for illegal immigrants, or undocumented immigrants, whichever you want to call them. Once agreed, she cast her vote to prevent a government shutdown over the issue. She did not want to do it and expressed as much in an interview. She's been one of the most successful Democrats at getting progressive legislation passed. All of those facts make it seem very unlikely to be a motive for the killer and cannot be a motive for shooting John Hoffman, who voted against the Republicans. Not only that, but the legislature in Minnesota was split evenly, so killing Democrats would give the Republicans an advantage to pass even more bills that would be disagreeable to a Democrat or a leftist. If you're against Republicans, then it obviously would not make sense to kill Democrats in such a narrow legislature. But that's where we're at now. The Republicans now have an advantage because Democrats were assassinated. And we are expected to believe that it was a leftist who did that. Did the Democrats who were shot have a common denominator that could be a reason for targeting them? Yes. They were both very outspoken supporters of abortion rights. They were instrumental in passing legislation securing abortion rights in Minnesota after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and their killer was vehemently anti-abortion and planned to target abortion providers as well. That is a motive consistent across all the people targeted. Argument number two, the killer was appointed to a government position by Tim Walz, the Democrat governor of Minnesota, so the killer can't possibly be a Republican. What are the facts? Tim Walz renewed his already existing appointment to the Governor's Workforce Development Board, which is an apolitical, nonpartisan, nothing-burger community committee that currently has Republicans on it. There are many open positions on such boards which you can get simply by volunteering, and they do not bother with your political affiliation. A spokesperson for the governor said that the governor doesn't even interview applicants to such boards. It's likely that the killer never even met Tim Walz, and that all Tim Walz did was sign a form letter just like he did for all the other members. So that seems like an extremely weak reason to call him a Democrat, especially in light of all the other evidence. If I may speculate on that beyond the facts, I suspect that it's projection, and the people who make such arguments cannot imagine themselves working with the opposing party, even though Tim Walz constantly does exactly that. It stems from difficulty imagining people thinking differently than yourself, a lack of empathy. I suspect it's projection because it was actually Donald Trump who wanted party loyalty tests for hiring new government employees. Regardless, it wasn't even a government employee position. It was strictly an unpaid, voluntary community board with Republicans currently on it. So again, very weak, yet there were influencers who used it to actually call the killer a good friend of Tim Walz, a man he likely never met, and a man who was literally on his kill list. That's how egregiously these influencers will lie to you. The third and final argument I've seen is that there were pieces of paper with no kings written on them found in the fake police car he used while committing the murders. You see, he disguised himself as a policeman when he did the killings and wore a rubber mask to hide his face. So he was actively taking steps to hide his identity and present himself as something he was not. No Kings was what the nationwide protests were called that day. Why did he have a bunch of papers with those words written on them? For that, we currently have no facts to turn to, so we can only speculate. In light of all the other evidence against him, is it enough to call him a Democrat? Not even close. So what were they doing there? Well, there could be many different reasons. One reason could be that he planned to use them as calling cards so that far-right people would do exactly what they're doing now and use them as evidence that he was a Democrat, leftist, or a No Kings protester. The guy took steps to disguise himself, and obviously did not intend to be caught for us to know his real history. And since he was willing to disguise himself as a policeman while doing the crimes, why wouldn't he also disguise himself after the crimes were done, like a No Kings protester? If that's true, then all these far-right influencers are doing exactly what this murderer wanted them to do. It's just crazy that it still worked even though he was caught and we know his far-right extremist history. Another reason could be that someone left a stack of those papers out for the protesters to use and he simply stole them because he doesn't like them. I've seen people take entire stacks of political flyers and steal political signs for that very reason. I even got one on video. Take a look. Here's dash cam footage I personally took of someone I saw angrily kicking down a Hillary Clinton sign back in 2016. He then removed the sign and put it in the back of his pickup truck. Can you imagine if he then killed a bunch of people while having that Hillary Clinton sign in his truck? Would it prove that he was a Hillary supporter? Of course not. He was precisely the opposite. Would people use it to claim he was a Clinton supporter? Of course they would. It could be the same situation for this killer of Democrats. So, those are the three arguments that convinced millions of people that prominent Democrat politicians were assassinated by a Democrat. I don't believe that all, or maybe even most, of the people who made those ridiculous arguments actually believe in them. It's all about pushing that narrative, protecting that narrative. The New York Post was quick to create this extremely misleading headline, which no longer exists, by the way, and it no doubt helped give the influencers their talking points, including Trump himself, who referred to the killer as a Walls appointee. They know what they're doing. What's disturbing is that large influencers with millions of followers and even far-right politicians like Republican Senator Mike Lee, who made these despicable tweets he has since deleted, and even Elon Musk himself with his garbage tweets, are now actively participating in protecting the narrative that leftists are violent by pushing the lie that this killer of Democrats was himself a Democrat. You can see the lies in support of the narrative being repeated by accounts all across the internet, in tweets, Facebook posts, YouTube videos, comment sections of news articles, etc. And I'm sure many of those comments are real. But I also suspect that many of them are bot accounts used to create an illusion of consensus by people with a vested interest in pushing certain narratives. Never blindly believe something just because you see a bunch of comments that support it. Chatbots that can pass a Turing test are absolutely everywhere now, deployed by governments, scammers, and propagandists alike, so beware of that. One rather infuriating phenomenon is when people who share the beliefs of the killer blame the victims for being killed. For example, I saw this Fox News article titled, "Ex-Vikings player blames Tim Walz for Minnesota lawmaker killings, example of a weak, emasculated leader." The article says that the ex-Viking player believes the assassination was the result of Democrats and Walz's leadership. The main absurdity of this goofy article is that it even exists in the first place. Nobody would know or care about this guy's political beliefs if it weren't for his football career. Yet because Fox News has influence over people, we now have to address him. He said, quote, "On this Father's Day, I wish Minnesota would focus on restoring fatherhood, protecting women, protecting families. Tim Walz is the example of a weak, emasculated leader. That is not what God made fathers to be. It's pathetic." Unquote. He actually chose to say that after Democrats were murdered by this guy.
I'm excited about God.
Je suis excité de Dieu.
And I want to worship Him.
Et c'est pourquoi je l'adore.
God.
The murderer himself would wholeheartedly agree with this football player that Fox News gave a giant platform to use to blame the Democrats for being murdered by a guy who agrees with the far right. It's their own fault for being murdered. That's what we're being told now. We're being told that the people who were killed, the people who fought tooth and nail, so that at least undocumented children could still get medical benefits, are the ones who aren't protecting families. That's how egregious the propaganda is. A perfect inversion of reality. The people who talk about protecting families gleefully post, "I voted for that," when they see families torn apart and deported. I highly doubt I need to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Compare the immediate reaction right-wing influencers had when Democrat lawmakers were assassinated to the immediate reaction they had after the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. Without knowing anything, they immediately accused the would-be assassin of either being a Democrat, a far leftist, or both, and that he was obviously inspired by vitriolic rhetoric used against Donald Trump. Back when their politician was shot at, the motive wasn't even questioned. It was obvious to them, even when there were still zero details. There's always a double standard. If leftist or Democrat influencers said, no, the assassin was actually a Republican, then they would have called those influencers absolutely insane, because that's pretty much what happened. It was discovered that the guy was actually a registered Republican. But that info was completely ignored or disbelieved by many right-wingers because he also happened to make a $15 donation when he was 17 years old through Act Blue to the Progressive Turnout Project. Either way, the FBI said there's very little information about his political views, that he had been planning an attack for over a year, researching various events, but then settled on the Trump rally shortly after it was announced. So they think it was a target of opportunity. At least in that case, I can understand why a right-winger would assume that a guy who tried to assassinate Trump is on the political left. That is at least consistent. It makes sense. Despite contradictory evidence, it became a guilt by association campaign. Everyone understood that was going to happen no matter what. And to this day, right-wingers point the finger, saying, you guys tried to kill Trump, even after everything we learned about the assassin. What I learned about the assassin of Democrats, however, is that sadly, regardless of who is killed or who does the killing, and no matter how strong the evidence, right-wing influencers will always immediately flood social media with claims that it was a leftist or a Democrat or a transgender person or insert political enemy, even when they know very little, and even when it's Democrats who are targeted. That's because it's important for the maintenance of their narrative to do so. Truth be damned. That narrative being that only Democrats and leftists do political violence. That narrative works very well, specifically because of the imbalance in the rhetoric I mentioned earlier. How well would that narrative work, however, if leftists engaged in the same tactic? What you won't typically find in the current leftist rhetoric is constant reminders of the recent violence committed by right-wingers, so it's very easy to just memory hole them. If you're a conservative, you can probably list acts of violence by people you consider leftists right off the top of your head. You'll think of LA riots, Tesla vandalism, a transgender mass shooter, the attempted assassinations of Donald Trump or Steve Scalise, and you'll think of them even if you know nothing of their political affiliations. But how often have you seen references to recent acts of right-wing violence? Like the Jacksonville Dollar General shooting, 3 killed by a white supremacist. The Allen, Texas outlet mall shooting, 7 wounded, 8 killed by a neo-Nazi white supremacist. The Buffalo supermarket shooting, 3 wounded, 10 killed by a white supremacist. The Boogaloo murders of Oakland and Santa Cruz, 3 wounded, 2 killed. The El Paso Walmart shooting, 26 wounded, 22 killed by an anti-immigrant white nationalist. The Poway synagogue shooting, 3 wounded, 1 killed by an anti-Semitic racist. The Jeffersontown Kroger shooting, 2 killed by an anti-black racist. The murder of Robert Miller, a black man burned by a white supremacist. The Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, 7 wounded, 11 killed by a white supremacist anti-Semite. The murder of Blaze Bernstein, killed for being gay. The murder of Michonne Cooper Williams, a black woman stabbed to death by a white supremacist. The murders of Danny and Deanna Lorenzo, killed by neo-Nazis. The murder of Richard Collins III, who was stabbed to death by a neo-Nazi. The car ramming attack at the Unite the Right rally, 28 wounded, 1 killed by a neo-Nazi white supremacist. The Portland train attack, 1 wounded, 2 killed by a neo-Nazi white nationalist. The murder of Timothy Kaufman, stabbed to death by an anti-black racist. The train wreck movie shooting, 9 wounded, 2 killed by a neo-Nazi white supremacist. The Colorado Springs Planned Parenthood shooting, 9 wounded, 3 killed by an anti-abortion Christian extremist. The Charleston church shooting, 1 wounded, 9 killed by a white supremacist. Those are just some of the right-wing killings of the last decade in the United States alone. Several of the more recent killers on that list said that they were inspired by the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand, which resulted in 89 wounded and 51 killed by an anti-immigration white supremacist. That man and several of the more recent killers cited various right-wing influencers as inspiration, usually the ones fear-mongering about communism, cultural Marxism, and white replacement. There is no recent equivalent of this level of political murder on the left, and leftists could easily bring up these many anecdotes of deadly hate crimes over and over and over again. But why doesn't that happen? Because they aren't compelled by anecdotes, and they know that these murderers don't speak for the millions of conservatives out there who are not murdering people. Bigotry is not compelling to them. To them, it's an unintelligent point to say that so-and-so was a right-winger who killed people, therefore you are somehow implicated in that. Unless, of course, you're an influencer cited by said murderer, in which case your very label as an influencer speaks to your role. You influenced it. People like Tim Pool, Alex Jones, Nick Fuentes, Ben Shapiro, Steven Crowder, Donald Trump, and many others like them have been cited by murderers as inspiration. Their common denominator is that they're all fear-mongers about leftists and immigrants. The tactic of right-wing influencers is to paint all Democrats and leftists as being on the verge of wanting to kill you, your entire family, or to replace you and to burn down entire cities across America. To them, collective blame is compelling, which is why their killers are always motivated by bigotry. They're playing chess without any rules, and in the process, they play on your fears, which is why the right dominates on social media and successfully pushes their narrative. If you are a right-leaning person, I'd imagine that you're thinking I'm just glossing over things like the 2020 riots, in which 19 people were killed and somewhere between $1 and $2 billion in damages was done. In actuality, glossing over that event would be to just dismiss every act of violence that summer as leftist, and nobody can honestly do that. It was a massive nationwide event. Around 20 million people participated in demonstrations across the country that summer. And it wasn't just leftists who had a problem with what happened to George Floyd, nor police brutality in general, at least in the moment before the narrative had time to spread its lies. 7,305 of the demonstrations, that's 96.3% of them, resulted in no violence and no damages. Human nature, and especially political propaganda, does not focus on widespread peaceful events. They focus on the violent 3.7%. Between May 26th and June 8th, there was arson, vandalism, and looting. There were also pretty egregious acts of unwarranted police brutality that escalated rather than de-escalated the unrest. That is done on purpose to justify normalizing using government force against the people. That's why unrest happened throughout Trump's first term, didn't happen under 4 years of Biden, and is now happening again under Trump's second term. It's not because leftists like Biden. They don't. It's because of how Trump responds to opposition and to peaceful protests. During the 2020 protests, 14,000 arrests were made. Some were unavoidable. For instance, a line of police would order people in the street to disperse west, only to be met with a line of police in the west ordering them to disperse east, effectively trapping them and making it impossible to comply. They would then arrest them for non-compliance. That's being done now in LA, by the way. They detain people until after curfew and then arrest them for violating curfew.
They're getting orders saying that we can't leave. It's not 8 o'clock. Do you hear that? They're saying nobody leaves. It's not the 8 o'clock curfew. They've trapped us in here. They've surrounded us all in here. It was a peaceful protest. No one got violent. They got violent. They're waiting until curfew to arrest us all. They let the press go. So my message to the press, look, they're moving in on us, y'all, for no reason. We're not doing anything. They trapped us in here.
Maybe just stay here right now.
We're under arrest.
Under arrest for what?
They said we're under arrest.
For what? What is under arrest?
Okay.
We're from the city of Los Angeles.
We're under arrest, you guys. And
But of course, not everyone was innocent. I'm not trying to say that. During the summer of 2020, yes, many crimes were committed. There's no doubt about that. But do the people who label all the crimes that summer as leftists go and check the political affiliations of anyone who was arrested or convicted? No, of course not. To them, it's obvious. But is that justifiable? It got to the point where any crime that occurred within a city that had a protest was automatically blamed on BLM, Democrats, leftists, or Antifa before any facts came out. Unlike the January 6th storming of the Capitol, the rioters in 2020 didn't all wear political merch indicating who they voted for. There were opportunistic looters who had nothing to do with any protest. The tragic murder of retired police captain David Dorn was used as a lightning rod against BLM. BLM murdered a black man, was the rhetoric being spread. What happened was that Dorn tried to stop some people from stealing televisions out of his friend's pawn shop. A man named Stefan Cannon was allegedly the murderer and subsequently convicted and sentenced to life in prison after a 3-day trial. Incidentally, he was convicted even though he was linked to no forensic evidence, no murder weapon, and no witnesses who saw him shoot anybody.
Mike, no forensic evidence, no murder weapon, and no witnesses saying they saw Stefan Cannon pull the trigger.
Assuming he did it, do we know anything about Stefan Cannon's politics? I can't find a single thing. News of his conviction subsumes everything else about him. Is stealing a television inherently leftist? No, but that would never stop propagandists from saying that BLM or Democrats or leftists or Antifa or insert political enemy killed David Dorn, turning his tragic murder into a juicy opportunity. And for a lot of people, sadly, a post from a popular social media influencer with 0 citations will be all the evidence they need to come to a conclusion. A man with an AK-47 fired 13 rounds at a police station in Minneapolis during the riots. Many people assumed he was a leftist. Was he? No. His name was Ivan Hunter Harrison, and he was a far-right extremist, a self-professed boogaloo boy, according to his Facebook account, and he drove up to Minnesota from Texas to cause trouble. I mean, you hear that 19 people were killed during the riots of 2020, and you may be tempted to assume that they were all innocent people killed by vicious leftists, but that's just not true. A lot of them were claimed to be self-defense. 2 of them were killed by Kyle Rittenhouse, for instance. And whether you think he did it in self-defense or not, it's still more complicated than some sort of leftist murder spree. Likewise, many others of those 19 killed during the riots were also allegedly killed in self-defense, like Calvin Horton Jr., David McCaddy, Tyler Newby, and James Scurlock. Barry Perkins was a protester who was run over by a FedEx truck and killed. David Patrick Underwood was a security guard at a federal building in California, killed during the riots by a man named Stephen Carrillo, another far-right extremist boogaloo boy who went there as an agent provocateur. He got life in prison. Jorge Gomez was shot and killed by police after they told protesters to disperse. None of the officers had body cameras, but security footage from a nearby building showed Gomez running away from the police when they shot him. Not to worry, the police investigated themselves and found that they did nothing wrong. The point I'm trying to make here is that the 19 deaths of the 2020 riots have a very different dynamic than an anti-immigrant extremist deliberately murdering a bunch of Hispanics at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, which was the case for Patrick Wood Crucius, who shot 45 people there, more than all the 2020 riots combined, killing 22 of them. In his words, because of the, quote, Hispanic invasion and cultural and ethnic replacement, unquote. Gee, I wonder where he heard that. Well, we don't really have to wonder, because he was a massive Trump fan and parroted all of Trump's slogans on his social media accounts. He was naturally a registered Republican, yet how often have you heard the name of Patrick Crucius? How often have you recently heard about what he did, an act that got him 90 life sentences? And he's just one of the many right-wing terrorists, including the ones I listed earlier, that you just never, ever hear about, because people on the left and people on the right are compelled by very different forms of rhetoric. If a leftist wanted to use right-wing style rhetoric and lean into the fear and bigotry in order to smear and implicate millions of people with crimes they had nothing to do with, then they would have an absolutely endless goldmine of blood, gore, death, and tears to work from, all generated by the far right. But they just don't do that. It's against their ideals, and it's uncompelling to them. Hell, the only reason I'm mentioning it now is to address the lies, because if the narrative was honest, I'd have no reason to speak on it. What's most ironic of all is that the rhetoric of fear and bigotry that is so successful for the right is the very same kind of rhetoric that inspires right-wing terrorism in the first place. Isn't that maddening? The very people who constantly lie about left-wing violence are the same ones who inspire the far more deadly right-wing violence. People are so often the very cause of the problems they themselves complain about. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, quote, far-right terrorism has significantly outpaced terrorism from other types of perpetrators, including from far-left networks and individuals inspired by the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. Right-wing attacks and plots account for the majority of all terrorist incidents in the United States since 1994, and the total number of right-wing attacks and plots has grown significantly during the past 6 years. Right-wing extremists perpetrated 2/3 of the attacks and plots in the United States in 2019 and over 90% between January 1st and May 8th, 2020, unquote. It stops there, not because they didn't want to include the 2020 riots, but because it was published on June 17th of 2020 and likely written before the riots. So I sought more current statistics to see if there has been a shift. First finding the ADL, but I knew people on the right would likely consider that a biased source. So I sought something more neutral and found the National Institute of Justice, which does scientific research on domestic terrorism, has a study on right-wing terrorism specifically, and is an official website of the United States government. Unfortunately, I could not obtain those statistics for you from that site because that information was made unavailable in order to be in compliance with an executive order from President Trump himself. Isn't that interesting? So let's find other sources. Out of curiosity, what does the ADL say anyway? They say, quote, right-wing extremist terror incidents in the United States have been increasing since the mid-2000s, but the past 6 years have seen their sharpest rise yet. There were just 7 right-wing terror incidents in the period from 2005 to 2007, but by 2017 to 2019, there were 27, which increased to 40 in 2020 to 2022, unquote. This was published in 2023, and they say that from 2017 to 2022, there were 67 incidents of right-wing terrorism, resulting in 58 deaths. On to another source, according to the Statistical Research Department, quote, between 2014 and 2023, 76% of all domestic extremist-related killings in the United States were carried out by right-wing extremists. During this time period, 19% of extremist-related killings were carried out by perpetrators affiliated with domestic Islamist extremism, unquote. You know what else is very interesting? Besides making government statistics on right-wing terrorism unavailable because of an executive order, is that all these attacks dramatically increased right after Trump got involved in politics, with all of his divisive, fear-mongering rhetoric echoed by these killers. What about another source? Let's go beyond the United States. Let's go to the GTD, the Global Terrorism Database, which has info on over 200,000 terrorist attacks, including 88,000 bombings, 19,000 assassinations, and 11,000 kidnappings, all since 1970. What does that worldwide wealth of information tell us? Well, it tells us that attacks by Islamist extremists are 131% more likely to result in fatalities than attacks by right-wing extremists, and attacks by left-wing extremists are 45% less likely to result in fatalities than attacks by right-wing extremists. So the left is by far the least deadly of the ideologies, at least since 1970. This will confuse some of the more ignorant right-wingers because they consider Islam to be aligned with the left, which is absurdly false. Moderate Muslims could be leftists, just like moderate Christians can be as well. But if you're killing people, you're not moderate. Islamic extremists are very patriarchal. They're against women's rights. They're very much against LGBT people. They're religious fundamentalists, and they mix religion with government. They resemble the far right significantly more than the far left. So why do some right-wingers mistake them as left? Because leftists in the West tend to stand up for minorities, and Muslims are a minority in the West. We in the West also have the benefit of not being classified as terrorists when our governments bomb Muslims, even when most of the casualties are civilian, or when the strikes are done with the specific intent to demoralize and intimidate, the very definition of terrorism. Trump said that he left orders that if Iranian officials had him assassinated, Iran is to be completely leveled until there's nothing left.
That would be a terrible thing for them to do, not because of me. If they did that, they would be obliterated. That would be the end. I've left instructions. If they do it, they get obliterated. There won't be anything left.
That's using one death to justify 90 million deaths. An obvious extreme absurdity. Yet how often have you heard his base talk about it or object to it? Who's really more violent and more accepting of widespread violence here? Between the right and the left, the stats don't lie. Left-wing extremists are the least likely to kill you. That will seem absurd to many right-wingers because they are ideologically captured by the narrative, just like Elon Musk is. It's all about what they focus on and what they ignore. For instance, there's about 20,000 murders in the United States per year. You never hear about the vast majority of those murders, but I bet you have heard about Laken Riley, for instance. That's because her murder was used to push a narrative that a significant portion of those 20,000 Americans killed per year are being killed in an invasion by illegal immigrants, so construed as a literal invasion by foreign countries that Trump invoked the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to circumvent the Constitution, the same act that was used to put Japanese American citizens in internment camps during World War II. If you were Japanese, they could put your entire life on hold and lock you up. Likewise, now, if you're Hispanic, agents in plain clothes and masks can just pick you up and disappear you, citizen or not. Doesn't matter. It's happening. If you're an Arab woman who writes an op-ed saying that the United States should cut ties with Israel, agents in plain clothes can take you off the sidewalk near your home in Boston and send you to a camp in Louisiana against judges' orders. That happened. First, Fourth, Fifth, Eighth, and 14th Amendments all be damned. After all, we're being invaded, and you have much to fear. So sacrifice your freedom and your rights and suspend the Constitution. Is that patriotic? What is worth this precedent of giving up your constitutional rights? Once you give them up, they're very difficult to get back. What are you so afraid of that you're willing to turn America into a police state? Well, according to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, 29 people were killed in homicides or manslaughters by illegal immigrants in 2024. That's 29 too many, of course. I'm wondering, though, why there's such disproportionate fear and outrage for those 29, and usually only a few of those 29 repeated in the rhetoric, compared to the other 19,971 killed by native-born American citizens. Could it be because it's a disingenuous talking point designed to stoke fear and outrage? Looks like it. Their so-called invasion would have to kill 690 times more people just to equal the number of Americans killed by Americans. And such fear-mongering has ironically inspired even more killings by anti-immigrant white nationalist extremists. Incidentally, with 20,000 Americans murdered per year, that's a rate of around 7.5 per capita. Our far more liberal neighbors up north in Canada have around 2 homicides per capita compared to our 7.5. That's around 750 homicides per year compared to our 20,000. A lot of this puts Elon Musk's ignorant statements into perspective, doesn't it? Musk is ideologically captured. Has he studied the statistics? Has he examined all the events themselves? Obviously not. He blames it on legacy media. But you can learn all of this without relying on legacy media. And now he wants to alter his AI from giving correct answers to answers that align with the narrative he believes. That's very dangerous because a lot of people already treat AI as if it's omniscient, our future God. On June 21st, 2025, Musk told people to respond to his tweet with politically incorrect facts to help train Grok. The post was immediately flooded by far-right influencers pushing their narratives about the Holocaust, Gaza, black people, trans people, etc. That's exactly what we need, AI to be trained by a bunch of fucking racists. Musk wants you to believe that the left is extremely violent, more so than the right, against all the evidence and statistics, and he's trying to force AI to parrot that narrative. Let's see how Elon Musk alone compares to the violence he focuses upon. This demands that we sort of switch gears for a moment because the disproportionate deadliness of the violence from the right doesn't even scratch the surface of what we should be classifying as violence, yet do not. All of the violence I've been talking about so far has been very obvious forms of violence: shootings, killings, assassinations, riots, etc. But there is another kind of violence I'd like to tell you about, a kind that all too often goes overlooked, yet is far more deadly than everything I've mentioned so far. I want to ask you to rethink things you may have never even questioned before, like the true nature of violence, justice, and patriotism. There are things we misconceive every day that have very real and very serious consequences for millions of people. The negative consequences they suffer are enabled by our faulty perception of what's really going on. So it's absolutely vital that we start understanding as soon as possible. I was a child of the 70s. I grew up playing with plastic toy guns with my friends outside. We played cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians. Our young minds, even with our limited exposure to the world, perceived robbers and Indians as the violent ones, and the cops and cowboys as the peacekeepers, the ones who brought justice and protected innocent people. Those misconceptions persist into adulthood. We look at someone like Elon Musk posting pictures of rioters and we say, stop doing violence. Strive to be more like Elon Musk, a pillar of society, a visionary, and a genius. We see video of a policeman tackling and injuring someone for ignoring his commands, and we say, just comply. It's not hard. If you just did what you were told, then you'd be fine. Or we see someone being picked up by ICE and deported, and we say, don't come here illegally. If you want to be a citizen, then do it the right way. Simple. But what if everything I just told you is wrong? And not just a little bit wrong, but paradigm shifting, colossally wrong? What if it's someone who is here legally, maybe even born here? As Trump says, the homegrowns are next. What if law enforcement abusing their authority has significantly worse consequences than someone illegally crossing a border? What if it's a severely autistic teen who doesn't even understand the policeman's orders? Or someone who can't physically comply? What if Elon Musk is one of the most violent people who has ever walked the face of the earth, far more violent than an entire city of rioters combined? Now, right away, that will sound ridiculous to many of you, and I can understand why. Think of all the criminals out there, the mass shooters, serial killers, warlords, etc., who you would be far more likely to think of as significantly more violent than Elon Musk. I want you to rethink that. Understand that you may have faulty perceptions that lead you to bad conclusions. Bad conclusions result in problems either not being solved or being exacerbated. When you go to Elon Musk's X, formerly Twitter, you'll find that those who hate black people are well embedded there. It's a place where terabytes of propaganda are uploaded every day, accusing black people of being violent criminals by their very nature, while Musk is praised as a genius and a visionary. Let me offer you an alternate perspective on that dynamic. For instance, there's a place called Boxtown in South Memphis, Tennessee. The residents there are predominantly black people. Elon Musk was kind of late to jump on board the AI craze. At first, he was against it and even warned that it's dangerous, even apocalyptically so. Thus, he reasoned that it needs to be strictly regulated.
I think AI is one of the biggest threats. But I do think it's one of the existential risks that we face, and it's potentially the most pressing one. If you look at the time scale and the rate of advancement, I think the summit is timely, and I applaud the Prime Minister for holding it.
But as others began securing a foothold in the new exploding AI industry, Musk quickly abandoned his doomsaying and professed principles, something quite common for him, and rushed to catch up. This included a massive data center with 35 methane-burning gas turbine generators that was quickly constructed on 500 acres in Boxtown in order to supply his new facility with the requisite energy. Now, you need some pretty serious permits for that sort of thing for a very good reason. You address these things with the local community for a very good reason. But Musk did neither. Musk hates regulations when they apply to him, you see. He thinks they just get in the way. Lawyers did records requests with the local government and with the EPA and found that they had no permits on record. So not only was he using these generators without permits, but he was using far more than were allowed, even if he had permits. Those regulations aren't arbitrary. They exist for a very good reason, and Musk isn't the one who has to learn that reason the hard way. Musk's answer for using too many generators was that only about half of them were being used, so it's okay. And since there's a nationwide shortage of these turbine generators, it seems kind of dubious that he'd have so many of them just lying around doing nothing. So a flyover of the facility was done with an infrared camera, and it showed that all the generators were, in fact, being used, and that Musk was just lying as usual. That didn't really matter, though, because as luck would have it, Musk would end up having direct control over those regulating him in the government. How convenient! Those are the perks of buying a president. So naturally, nothing would be done about it. Thus, an immigrant would be free to harm American citizens. Pretty ironic, huh? The result? Terribly polluting emissions inflicted upon Boxtown, including formaldehyde and nitrogen oxide. These are linked to asthma, heart disease, and cancer.
We here because we mean business. People here want answers. It's the job of the health department to protect our lungs, and not once have they went to XAI to see that they had 35 gas turbines operating and polluting our air. We went to Memphis and found an environmental crime scene. Musk's data center burning enough methane to power a small city with no permits and no pollution controls.
I have not seen anything like this. We believe they've already violated the Clean Air Act.
As Musk helps dismantle the very federal agency that's supposed to protect us against pollution like this,
there is no way to miss how this is a coordinated strategy.
I watched several interviews with residents of Boxtown, and it's quite unbearable for them. The stink is always present. There's no escape from it. It's there when they wake up in the morning and when they go to bed at night. It's not just outside, it's inside their homes. Leaving town is a relief. Going home is dreaded.
When I smelled it the first time, I was asleep. And it woke me up because I thought gas was seeping in the house, but come to find out, we come outside and all the neighbors was outside trying to figure out what's going on.
Musk has helped the Trump administration place strict limits on the EPA's budget as part of President Trump's broader project to radically reshape the agency. Trump's EPA has begun what it calls the biggest deregulatory action in U.S. history.
To fulfill President Trump's promise to unleash American energy and give power back to the states.
It eliminated the EPA's office that assists heavily polluted communities like South Memphis and canceled billions of dollars of funding for addressing pollution.
I have found that working with Elon and Doge has been fantastic, a big help to our efforts.
In March, the EPA announced plans to roll back over 30 air and water quality standards, including protections against fine particulate matter. The new head of the agency describes promoting the AI industry as a core part of the EPA's mission.
Now, I want you to use this example to rethink the rhetoric of crime and violence. If you are physically attacked by a mugger, it will be very traumatic for you. If you are struck, it could result in pain that lasts for weeks. If you end up with a broken bone, that's going to hurt for months. If your wallet or purse is taken, you lose all the money that was on you. And you have to cut off your credit cards and get new ones. You have to get a new driver's license, maybe replace whatever other cards you had, take steps to prevent identity theft, etc. It's a big hassle. If the mugger is caught, then they could face some well-deserved jail time, be forced to pay restitution, possibly have to do community service and probation. They'll have a criminal record that will affect their rights and future employment. Think about all those consequences that result from that violent act between one human being and another. It's obvious violence, and it's obviously immoral. But now I want you to think about what it would be like to get cancer or a respiratory illness that will last the rest of your life. Breathing affects everything you do. If you can't breathe well, then you're miserable, period. Nothing else matters. There is no relief after a couple months of wearing a cast, as there would be with a broken wrist, for example. You end up losing thousands of dollars due to medical bills, rather than just what you happen to have in your wallet or purse that day. Even your house is stolen from you in a way, not because you don't want to live there anymore due to the emissions, but because nobody else would either, so you're not going to get what you paid for it if you can even sell it at all. And none of that happened naturally. A person knowingly did that to you for their own personal gain and took extra steps to get away with it, to escape accountability, like a mugger evading police. And they didn't just do it to you, they did it to your neighbors too. And the person most responsible for doing that will not have to set a single foot in prison. In fact, he'll be praised, encouraged, and fawned over by the very same people who call you violent by nature. Rethink crime and violence. When most people see Elon Musk, they don't think of a violent criminal the way they would if they saw footage of someone being attacked and mugged. But given their actual actions, the reality is that Elon Musk is significantly more violent than an entire mob of muggers or rioters. It's just that the violence looks very different. It's cloaked and gradual. It's not the drama of a window being smashed. It's gas silently seeping into your lungs and stealing your health for his benefit. It's not something to catch on video and go viral in a propaganda post. In fact, a whole group of muggers would have great difficulty manually replicating the magnitude of Musk's violent assault on that town alone. How could they? The police would likely stop them before they could even get close to doing as much damage. But what the police won't do is stop someone like Elon Musk. Musk will go on his website and harshly condemn a riot or the vandalizing of Teslas, and he gets to be taken seriously and not be seen as any sort of a hypocrite while doing that, because we have a very narrow perception of not only violence, but who engages in violence and how. If I were to ask you, however, would you rather have your car vandalized? Or would you rather end up with a lifelong respiratory illness, cancer, and the loss of your house? Which would you choose? I would not want either one of those things to happen to you, obviously, but I think we both know that if you were given the choice, you'd rush to choose the low-life vandal over what the so-called genius visionary Musk has done to others. If we were all forced to choose, then the line in front of the vandal would be quite long, and there would be no line in front of Musk. Yet in real life, we harbor far, far more contempt for the vandal than for Musk. At least a great many of us do. And I say, that's wrong. I say, that's the result of misconception. I want to give you another example out of the countless to choose from. See, we were sending antiretroviral medication to pregnant women with HIV in developing countries, the same countries in which we are told that people are just violent by their very nature. And taking that medication while they're pregnant prevents their babies from being born with HIV. And after Elon Musk was unlawfully given control of their funding, he cut off their medication in the name of wasteful government spending. That immediate result was at least 300 babies being born with HIV who otherwise wouldn't have, which they'll have for the rest of their lives and could result in their deaths. I want you to imagine being a pregnant mother with HIV in a developing country where the medication preventing your baby from getting AIDS is about $100 a month. And that medication being taken from you by the richest man on earth because he thinks it's wasteful. What's $100 to Musk? Well, in 2024, Elon Musk's wealth increased by $6,420 per second. That means picking up a $100 bill off the sidewalk would be a waste of his time. To pay for all 300 mothers for all 9 months of each of their pregnancies, it would take Musk 42 seconds of wealth accumulation. That's what he made. And much of that was paid by your taxes, which he did not cut off for himself, curiously. He cut it off for those babies. I want you to imagine what a room with 300 babies in it would look like. Imagine Elon Musk going from baby to baby and injecting them with HIV. We'd all recognize that as an absolutely unforgivable crime worthy of life in prison or even the death penalty. That imagined scenario may sound quite ridiculous to you, and of course, I don't think Elon Musk would physically do such a direct thing himself, but the result of what he actually did had the same effect. They wouldn't have had HIV if not for the actions of Elon Musk. When confronted with the results of his actions, Musk immediately denied it, no differently than any other criminal would deny their crime. The optics are so bad that he naturally, reflexively denied it. There is no real denying it, though. He stopped all the funding and even bragged about putting it in the wood chipper. He danced around on a stage with a chainsaw like a clown. He put on a show and wanted to be known for this before he knew the consequences of what he was doing. When he sought approval from those wanting to cut waste, fraud, and abuse in the government, he was more than willing to admit cutting all funding, which included their medication. Like a criminal bragging to his friends about stealing a car but then denying it to the police when he gets caught. When confronted with the results, he nonchalantly said that mistakes will be made and they'll look into things and restore certain things. And he has been known to lie about restoring funding that was never restored, like the Ebola prevention efforts that he said were accidentally canceled but promptly restored.
And I should say, we will make mistakes. We won't be perfect, but when we make a mistake, we'll fix it very quickly. So, for example, with USAID, one of the things we accidentally canceled very briefly was Ebola prevention. I think we all want Ebola prevention. So we restored the Ebola prevention immediately, and there was no interruption.
It's not that simple. Entire teams and contractors were dismantled and unpaid for work already done. Legal contracts were terminated. Communications are still cut off. By restored, he means that a waiver was quickly written up, but that waiver didn't do anything to restore any of the dismantling that occurred. The waiver didn't magically reassemble the teams and draw up new contracts. It rebuilt nothing. All that work needs to be done again now, but the money that was unfrozen still can't even be accessed. The purpose of the waiver after the damage was done was just so that Musk could stand in front of cameras and say that it was quickly restored, even though that's false in physical reality. And for people like those 300 babies, it will always be too little, too late to restore funding.
As to Elon Musk's statement at the White House that the Ebola activities had been restarted, it was not accurate then. It's not accurate now. Despite the Ebola response activities being the first that we pushed as soon as the waiver was issued, the activities were never allowed to move forward, and ultimately those contracts were terminated. We repeatedly raised the fact that we had partners that were at the airport ready to screen travelers to make sure that they did not have Ebola before leaving the country, but the activities could not start because the administration would not allow funding to move for those partners. And that we had 27,000 sets of PPE that we had already procured that were sitting and ready for immediate deployment at a warehouse in nearby Kenya that could have been deployed urgently. However, leadership up to and including Pete Morocco blocked the approval and the availability of funds, despite saying the opposite publicly and also in response to Congress, I understand, and certainly to the National Security Council.
According to UN Aid, there was also a waiver for pregnant mothers with HIV after their funding had been cut and those babies were already affected. So even though it's too late for them, at least now their need is acknowledged. But unfortunately, that's just the tip of the iceberg. According to UN Aid, if those programs are not restored in the next 4 years, aka Trump's term, it will result in an additional 6.6 million new HIV infections. That's around 2,300 additional new HIV infections per day, an additional 4.2 million AIDS-related deaths. That's over 600 additional AIDS-related deaths per day. And much of that AIDS prevention happens in developing countries, and there are many Americans who do not want their tax money to benefit those who aren't Americans, which is one reason Musk has gained so much support for Doge, despite the fact that it won't even put a tiny dent in the deficit, unlike he claimed. Not that anything I'm saying right now even matters to a white supremacist who doesn't mind if developing nations are wiped out with diseases. If you can't be convinced that it is simply a moral thing to do with our taxes, especially in light of how our taxes are far more likely to fuel the military-industrial complex, using your tax money to kill rather than cure. Consider it from a utilitarian perspective. Disease spreads. It's good for Americans if far fewer people in the world have deadly infectious diseases. But the bottom line is that the deaths of millions of people will be directly related to the actions Elon Musk took. Rethink how we perceive violence. When you think about the actual real-world results, Elon Musk is one of the most violent people who has ever walked upon the face of the earth. The problem is, most people do not think of him that way because Elon Musk's violence is cloaked, gradual, and normalized. He has a comfortable buffer between the results of his actions, like the politician who orders a drone strike while dining at a fancy restaurant. The truth is that by the end of Elon Musk's life, he will have directly contributed to the deaths of countless people. Elon Musk's violence is done with paperwork, however, and an army of employees doing what they're told. But just like the mugger, it results in people being physically and financially harmed so that Musk can gain wealth. The very same incentive and result as someone who does a violent robbery, except for Musk, it's worse because his violence and theft are at an industrial scale and go unpunished. Elon Musk belongs in prison. But we all know that won't happen, despite the fact that the few examples I've given here barely scratch the surface of the violence he has done. This video would need to be days long, possibly even weeks, just to cover it all in the detail it deserves. Tesla became profitable through the sale of carbon credits. Musk got to have a reputation as the CEO of a green company that cares about climate change. But in reality, they were selling their carbon credits so that other companies could pollute more. Tesla's first profitable year came not from selling cars, but from selling pollution. As with regulating AI, Musk claims to care about climate change, but the truth is that he's one of the most prolific polluters this planet has ever seen. Elon may be the most infuriating example because he gets so much undeserved credit. has an army of sycophants and does far more harm than good. But Elon Musk himself is just one example among countless others. It's not just Elon who gets away with egregious acts of violence because we fail to perceive it as such, but a great many people. The billionaire class, the corrupt politicians who work for them, and the corrupt law enforcement that does the corrupt politicians' bidding, right on down the line. It always happens this way. They seize all the power, turn everyone against each other, the whole thing collapses, and then we start all over again, never learning, always repeating the pattern. Are we really doomed to that cycle again? Is it really necessary? Can't we learn? Look, the bottom line is this. There's persistent narratives out there specifically designed to mislead you. And not just slightly, but massively so. So that you believe blatant lies are obvious truths. It's up to you to look beyond the narrative and straight at the actual events themselves, and not just the events they want you to look at, but the events they don't talk about and the people they don't talk about, because the narrative isn't just what they want to show you, it's also what they hide from you. And I say this to you not as a Republican and not as a Democrat. I'm neither. I say this to you as someone who greatly values the truth and wants you to believe what is true in a world that constantly bombards you with lies. Resist.